The rifle kicked against Elena Vasquez's shoulder like a mule, and the distant target dissolved into a blur of heat, shimmer, and failure. Again, the observation tower erupted in barely contained snickers, the kind that cut deeper than any drill sergeant's screaming ever could. 200 meters. She'd missed a stationary target at 200 meters, and every soul on the range knew it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Pack it up, Vasquez," barked Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, his weathered face twisted into the expression he reserved for the hopeless cases. "You're done for the day. Hell, you might be done, period." Elena's hands trembled as she engaged the safety, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over. Range 7. The September sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Brennan's training grounds, turning the Georgia clay into a furnace that seemed to mock her already burning cheeks. She could feel 43 pairs of eyes boring into her back. Her fellow cadets, the instructors, even the maintenance crew had stopped their work to witness her spectacular failure. Marcus Chun, her bunkmate and the closest thing she had to a friend in this place, shifted uncomfortably beside her. His own rifle lay perfectly zeroed, his target sheet riddled with precise holes that formed a pattern tight enough to cover with a quarter. Everything Elena's wasn't. "It's just one bad day," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind that swept across the range. "Everyone has them." But Elena knew better. This wasn't one bad day. This was her 15th consecutive day of missing shots that a 12-year-old with a pellet gun should have been able to make. 15 days of watching her dreams of becoming a Marine Corps sniper evaporate like morning dew under the scorching sun. 15 days of proving that maybe, just maybe, the doubters had been right all along. She shouldered the M40A5 sniper rifle, all 22 pounds of it, and began the long walk back to the armory. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of her family's expectations. Her father, Staff Sergeant Roberto Vasquez, had carried a rifle through 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her older brother Diego was currently deployed somewhere in the Pacific, living the Marine life she'd dreamed of since she was 8 years old and first saw him in dress blues. The rifle felt heavier with each step. It was a beautiful weapon. She had to admit the Macmillan, a 5 stock worn smooth by countless hands, the unearthed 10x scope that could pick out details at distances that seemed impossible. In the hands of someone competent, it was a tool of precision and power. In her hands, it might as well have been a 40-pound paperweight. "Vasquez." The voice cracked across the range like a whip. Sergeant Morrison was jogging toward her, his campaign hat casting a sharp shadow across his granite features. Behind him trailed Captain Sarah Reed, the range commander whose reputation for producing the Corps' best snipers was legend around Fort Brennan. Despite the crushing weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. "Yes, Gunnery Sopton turned. Captain Reed wants a word." Morrison's tone suggested this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. Captain Reed approached with the measured gait of someone who had seen too many promising careers end in disappointment. She was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw and weakness with surgical precision. At 38, she was the youngest range commander in Fort Brennan's history, and she'd earned the position by never accepting anything less than perfection. "Walk with me, cadet," Reed said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. They walked in silence past the various training ranges, the obstacle course where recruits crawled under barbed wire while instructors fired live rounds over their heads, the hand-to-hand combat pit where the sand was stained with blood and sweat, the rappelling tower that claimed at least one broken bone per training cycle. Fort Brennan was designed to break people, to separate those who could handle the pressure from those who would crack when bullets started flying for real. Elena was definitely in the latter category. "Tell me about your father," Captain Reed said, as they reached the edge of the parade ground. Her tone was conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made Elena more nervous than if she'd been screaming. "Staff Sergeant Roberto Vasquez, ma'am. 3 combat deployments, Purple Heart recipient, currently stationed at Camp Pendleton as a senior drill instructor. And your brother, Corporal Diego Vasquez, ma'am. Currently deployed with the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, Scout Sniper qualified." Captain Reed nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the tree line. "Good stock. Marine families tend to produce Marines. It's in the blood, they say." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a recently fired rifle. "So what's wrong with you?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. What was wrong with her? She'd been asking herself the same question for weeks now, lying awake at night in her narrow bunk while Marcus slept peacefully beside her, dreaming of the career that seemed to slip further away with each missed shot. "I don't know, ma'am," she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. "I want this more than anything. I've wanted to be a Marine since I was a kid. But every time I get behind that scope, everything just falls apart." Captain Reed stopped walking and turned to face her. For the first time since Elena had arrived at Fort Brennan, she thought she saw something that might have been sympathy in the captain's steel-gray eyes. "You know what I see when I watch you shoot, Vasquez? A failure, ma'am." Fear, the word hung between them like a physical presence. "You're so terrified of missing that you're guaranteeing you will miss. Your breathing is erratic, your grip is inconsistent, and you're pulling the trigger like you're trying to kill it. Everything about your fundamentals screams panic." Elena felt her cheeks burn. "I'm trying to fix it, ma'am. I practice every night with the dry fire trainer. I've read every manual in the library. I've watched hours of footage. And you've convinced yourself that technique alone will solve the problem," Reed interrupted. "But this isn't about technique anymore, is it? This is about fear. Fear of letting down your family. Fear of proving the doubters right. Fear of discovering that maybe you're not cut out for this after all." The accuracy of the assessment was like a knife to Elena's chest. She stared at the ground, unable to meet Captain Reed's penetrating gaze. "There's something else," Reed continued. "Something you're not telling me. I've seen your academic scores, top 5% of your class. Your physical fitness scores are excellent. Your leadership evaluations are outstanding. Everything about you screams future Marine officer, except for one thing. What happened, Vasquez? What made you afraid?" Elena's mind flashed back to a moment she'd tried to bury, tried to pretend never happened. The hunting trip with her father when she was 16. The deer that had looked up at her with trusting brown eyes, just as she squeezed the trigger. The way it had thrashed in the leaves, wounded but not dead, while she stood frozen with horror at what she'd done. Her father had had to finish it with his sidearm while Elena vomited into the bushes. "I hurt something once," she whispered. "Something that didn't deserve it. And I can't stop thinking that every time I aim at something, I might." She couldn't finish the sentence. Captain Reed was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the sounds of military life continued, the rhythmic chanting of recruits on a run, the sharp crack of rifles from the ranges, the mechanical whir of helicopters passing overhead. It was the soundtrack of Elena's dreams, and possibly the requiem for her ambitions. "You know what the irony is, Vasquez?" Reed finally said. "The best snipers I've known all shared one trait. They cared deeply about the weight of what they were doing. The ones who scared me, who didn't last long in the field, were the ones who treated it like a video game. The fact that you understand the gravity of taking a shot, even a practice shot, Tells me more about your character than 15 missed targets ever could." Elena looked up, surprised by the unexpected praise. "But here's the thing," Reed continued. "Character without competence will get Marines killed. And competence without confidence is just another form of incompetence. So here's what's going to happen. You've got one more week to figure this out. One more week to find whatever it is you need to find. Because if you wash out of this program, Vasquez, you'll never get another chance. The Corps doesn't give third chances to people who can't pull the trigger when it counts." The ultimatum hit Elena like a physical blow. One more week. 7 days to salvage 15 years of dreams, to justify her father's pride and her brother's faith. 7 days to prove she belonged in the same uniform they wore. "Understood, ma'am," she managed. Captain Reed started to walk away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "There's something else, Vasquez. Something I probably shouldn't tell you." She glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Your final qualification shoot isn't going to be at 200 meters. It's going to be at distance, real distance. The kind of shot that separates the pretenders from the genuine article. So whatever you're going to figure out, you'd better figure it out fast." As Captain Reed disappeared into the administration building, Elena stood alone on the parade ground, feeling smaller and more lost than she had since arriving at Fort Brennan. One more week. The phrase echoed in her mind like a countdown timer, each repetition bringing her closer to either her greatest triumph or her most devastating failure. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base, and in those shadows, Elena could almost see the ghosts of her future selves, the confident Marine she dreamed of becoming, and the broken failure she was terrified she already was. Somewhere in between those two extremes lay the truth she was going to have to discover. In the next 7 days, as she finally turned and headed back toward the barracks, Elena caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. There, mounted on the wall of the base museum, was a brass plaque commemorating the longest confirmed sniper kill in Marine Corps history. The distance was etched in stark numerals that seemed to pulse with impossible promise. 2,847 meters. Almost 3 kilometers. The kind of shot that required not just skill, but absolute faith in oneself and the laws of physics. The kind of shot that legends were made of. Elena stared at that number until it burned itself into her memory. She didn't know why, but something about it felt important, felt like a clue to a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, someway, that number was going to change everything. Question was, would she be ready when the moment came? Elena's alarm buzzed at 0430 hours. The same time it had buzzed every morning for the past 8 weeks at Fort Brennan. But this morning felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of Captain Reed's ultimatum had settled into her bones while she slept. She rolled out of her narrow bunk with practiced silence, careful not to wake Marcus, though she suspected he was already awake and pretending to sleep out of consideration for her obvious distress. The barracks was a symphony of controlled chaos. 48 future Marines in various stages of preparing for another day of training designed to test their limits and expose their weaknesses. Elena had grown to love these early morning moments, when the world was still dark and full of possibility, before the harsh light of day revealed just how far she was falling behind her peers. She dressed quickly in her utilities, the desert camouflage pattern that had become as familiar as her own skin. Every movement was automatic now, boots laced with precision, belt buckle aligned, cover positioned exactly 2 fingers above her eyebrows. The external discipline had become second nature. It was the internal chaos that threatened to destroy everything. The head was empty at this hour, giving Elena a few precious minutes of privacy to confront the face in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired, not just physically tired, but soul-deep exhausted in a way that 8 hours of sleep couldn't cure. Dark circles shadowed, brown eyes that had once sparkled with the kind of confidence that came from being the best at everything she attempted. Now those same eyes held only uncertainty and the growing fear that maybe excellence had been a temporary gift rather than a permanent trait. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping to shock some clarity into her thoughts. 7 days. The countdown had already begun, and she could feel each minute slipping away like sand through her fingers. "You're up early, even for you." Elena turned to find Corporal Jennifer Walsh emerging from one of the shower stalls, towel wrapped around her lean frame. Walsh was 3 years older than most of the cadets, a prior enlisted Marine who had earned her way into officer training through a combination of raw determination and battlefield experience in Syria. She carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who had already proven herself under fire. "Couldn't sleep," Elena admitted, turning back to the mirror to avoid Walsh's knowing gaze. "Reed got to you yesterday, didn't she?" Walsh's tone was conversational, but Elena could hear the concern underneath. Despite the competitive atmosphere of the training program, genuine friendships had formed among the cadets, bonds forged in shared misery and mutual support. "She gave me a week," Elena said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "One more week to figure out why I can't hit the broad side of a barn at 200 meters. Walsh was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "You know, when I was deployed, I worked with a sniper who used to miss everything during training. I mean everything. His instructors were ready to wash him out, send him back to the regular infantry. But something clicked for him when the stakes became real. He ended up being one of the best shots I ever worked with." "What made the difference?" "Purpose," Walsh said without hesitation. "In training, he was just shooting at paper targets. In the field, he was protecting his brothers. The target didn't matter, the mission did." Elena nodded, but the words felt hollow. She'd heard variations of this advice before, but knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two entirely different things. The truth was, she couldn't even imagine herself in a combat situation. Every time she tried to visualize it, her mind went blank, as if some essential part of her programming was missing. The morning PT formation gathered on the parade ground at 0500 sharp. 48 cadets arranged in perfect ranks under the harsh glare of the floodlights. First Sergeant Davis, a mountain of a man who had survived 3 combat tours and looked like he could survive 3 more, called them to attention with a voice that could have awakened the dead. "Today's training evolution will take place at the Advanced Marksmanship Range," Davis announced, his words carrying easily across the formation. "You will be engaging targets at distances up to 800 meters under various environmental conditions. This is not a qualification shoot, but your performance will be evaluated and recorded." Elena's stomach dropped. 800 meters. 4 times the distance that had been defeating her for weeks. She caught Marcus's concerned glance from the corner of her eye and tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. The march to the advanced range took 20 minutes through the Georgia pine forest that surrounded Fort Brennan. Elena had grown to love these walks the way the early morning mist clung to the trees, the sound of boots on gravel rhythmically marking time, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. But today, the forest felt oppressive, as if the trees were closing in to witness her failure. The Advanced Marksmanship Range was a marvel of military engineering, targets positioned at various distances and elevations, environmental sensors that could simulate different weather conditions, and observation towers equipped with high-powered scopes that could track every shot with ruthless precision. It was here that the Marine Corps separated those who could shoot from those who could truly engage targets under realistic conditions. "Vasquez, you're up first." Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through Elena's thoughts like a blade. 800 meters, wind at 5 knots from the northeast. Temperature dropping. Show us what you've learned. Elena approached the firing line with legs that felt like water. The M40A5 sniper rifle felt heavier than usual as she assumed the prone position, settling the bipod legs into the Georgia clay. Through the unearthed 10x scope, the target at 800 meters looked impossibly small, a silhouette that wavered in the heat, shimmer like a mirage. She tried to remember everything she'd been taught. Breath control, inhale, exhale halfway. Hold, natural point of aim, let the rifle settle where it wanted to point. Trigger control, straight, back with the pad of her index finger, not the joint. Follow through, hold the trigger back for a full second after the shot. But as she settled behind the scope, the familiar panic began to build in her chest. Her heart rate spiked, her breathing became shallow and erratic, and her grip on the rifle tightened with desperation rather than control. She could feel the eyes of her instructors and fellow cadets boring into her back, waiting for another spectacular failure. The crosshairs danced across the target like a drunken butterfly. Elena tried to steady them, but the harder she focused, the more they moved. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air, and she could feel her confidence evaporating with each passing second. "Take your time, Vasquez," Morrison sighed, though his tone suggested his patience was wearing thin. But not all day. Elena tried to calm herself, tried to find the zone that every sniper talked about, that moment of perfect clarity when the entire world reduced to the sight picture and the gentle squeeze of the trigger. But instead of clarity, she found only chaos. Her mind raced with doubts and fears, replaying every missed shot, every disappointed look, every whispered comment about the girl who didn't belong. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched the impact hit the dirt 2 feet. To the left of the target, another miss. Another failure in front of everyone who mattered. "Safe your weapon," Morrison ordered, his voice flat with resignation. "Next shooter." Elena engaged the safety and rolled away from the firing line, her face burning with shame. As Marcus took her place and began preparing for his shot, she caught a glimpse of Captain Reed in the observation tower. The captain was making notes on her clipboard, and Elena didn't need to see them to know what was being written. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of successful shots by her peers and increasingly creative ways for Elena to miss targets that should have been easy. Marcus managed a respectable grouping at 800 meters. Walsh put 3 shots into the center ring. Even the cadets who struggled with shorter distances managed to find the target. More often than not, only Elena seemed cursed with an inability to connect rifle to target in any meaningful way. During the lunch break, she found herself sitting alone at the edge of the range, staring out at the distant targets that had become symbols of her inadequacy. The MRE she'd been issued, chicken and dumplings, her least favorite, sat untouched beside her. Food had lost its appeal somewhere around the 15th consecutive miss. "Mind if I sit?" Elena looked up to find Captain Reed approaching with her own MRE and a metal cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. Without waiting for an answer, Reed settled herself on the concrete bench beside Elena, her movements economical and precise. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. Finally, Reed spoke. "When I was going through the program 20 years ago, I had a cadet in my class who reminded me a lot of you. Smart, dedicated, came from a military family. She could quote the manual chapter and verse, could field strip her rifle blindfolded, could run 5 miles faster than most of the men. But she couldn't hit anything beyond 100 meters to save her life." Elena waited, sensing there was more to the story. "We called her Magnet because she seemed to attract every possible way to miss a target. She'd hit low, hit high, hit left, hit right, but never where she was aiming. The instructors were convinced she was hopeless. Hell, she was convinced she was hopeless. What happened to her?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "She became one of the finest snipers the Corps has ever produced," Reed sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. 37 confirmed kills over 4 deployments. Currently serves as the chief instructor at Scout Sniper School in Quantico. Elena felt a flicker of hope, quickly followed by skepticism. What changed? Reed was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes distant with memory. She stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be effective. She realized that the rifle doesn't care about your fears or your family history or your need to prove yourself. It only cares about the fundamentals. And sometimes, the most important fundamental is learning to get out of your own way. I don't know how to do that, Elena admitted. Every time I get behind that scope, I feel like I'm carrying the weight of everything. My father's reputation, my brother's expectations, my own dreams. It's like I'm drowning in pressure. Then maybe it's time to stop carrying all that weight. Reed suggested. Maybe it's time to figure out what Elena Vasquez wants, not what everyone else expects Elena Vasquez to want. The words hit Elena with unexpected force. What did she want? The question seemed simple, but as she tried to answer it, she realized she'd been so focused on living up to other people's expectations that she'd never really examined her own motivations. Did she want to be a Marine because she loved the Corps, or because it was what was expected of her? Did she want to be a sniper because she felt called to that role, or because it would prove she was worthy of the family name? The questions swirled in her mind like leaves in a hurricane, and she found no easy answers. I need to think about that, Elena said finally. Captain Reed nodded and stood, preparing to head back to the observation tower. You've got 6 days left, Vasquez. Don't waste them trying to be someone else. Figure out who you are, and then learn to be that person with a rifle in your hands. As Reed walked away, Elena remained on the bench, staring out at the targets. That had become her personal demons. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to really think about what she wanted, rather than what was expected of her. The answer, when it finally came, surprised her with its simplicity. She wanted to serve. Not to prove herself, not to live up to some family legacy, but because she genuinely believed in the mission of protecting others. She'd felt it during humanitarian missions she'd participated in during college, the profound satisfaction of being part of something larger than herself, of using her skills and training to make a difference in the world. But somewhere along the way, that pure motivation had become tangled up with ego and expectation. She'd started seeing the rifle as a test of her worthiness rather than a tool for service. She'd turned every shot into a referendum on her character, rather than a simple application of physics and technique. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If she could remember why she'd wanted this in the first place, maybe she could find her way back to the fundamentals. But with only 6 days left, time was running out to put that theory to the test. As the afternoon training session resumed, Elena approached the firing line with a different mindset. Instead of thinking about Captain Reed watching from the tower or her fellow cadets judging her performance, she tried to focus on the simple mechanics of marksmanship. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. The shot went wide by 6 inches still. A miss, but the smallest miss she'd managed in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack in the wall of failure that had been building around her for so long. As she prepared for her next shot, Elena found herself thinking about that brass plaque in the museum, about the impossible distance of 2,847 meters. She didn't know why, but that number continued to haunt her thoughts, like a promise or a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. The second shot hit the target, barely just catching the outer edge, but a hit nonetheless. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't quite as hopeless as everyone thought. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Elena was cleaning her rifle in the armory, going through the meditative process of breaking down each component and ensuring every surface was free of carbon buildup, when Marcus burst through the doors with an expression that mixed excitement and dread. "Emergency briefing in 10 minutes, he panted, still catching his breath from his sprint across the base. "All cadets, no exceptions, something big is happening." Elena reassembled her M40A5 with practiced efficiency, her hands working automatically while her mind raced through possibilities. Emergency briefings were rare at Fort Brennan, the kind of thing that usually meant either a training exercise was about to become very real, or real-world events were about to impact their insulated world of military preparation. The briefing room was packed beyond capacity, with cadets standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls while the senior staff filed in with grim expressions. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, took the podium with the bearing of a man about to deliver news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martinez began, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. At 0347 hours Eastern Standard Time, terrorist forces launched a coordinated attack against 3 American embassies in North Africa. Initial reports indicate heavy casualties among both civilian staff and Marine security details. The President has authorized immediate deployment of rapid response forces to secure the affected areas and evacuate remaining personnel. A murmur ran through the assembled cadets, not panic, but the controlled tension of warriors who understood that their training was about to be put to the ultimate test. Elena felt her stomach clench as the implications became clear. "Effective immediately. This installation is being converted to a forward staging area for Operation Blazing Shield," Martinez continued. "Your training schedule is suspended. Instead, you will be providing direct support to active duty units preparing for deployment. This is not a drill, people. This is what you've been preparing for." Elena's mind reeled. She'd imagined her first taste of real military operations would come after graduation, after she'd proven herself capable of the basics. Now suddenly, she was being thrust into supporting actual combat operations, while still struggling to hit targets at basic ranges. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Cadet assignments are as follows. Alpha Company will be providing logistical support for the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. Bravo Company will assist with equipment preparation and maintenance. Charlie Company." He paused, his eyes finding Elena in the crowd. "Charlie Company will be providing overwatch and perimeter security for the staging areas." Elena's blood turned to ice. Overwatch meant snipers. Perimeter security meant live fire authority. In other words, Charlie Company cadets would be expected to perform the exact mission they'd been training for, with real ammunition, protecting real lives, while actual terrorists posed actual threats. The briefing continued with a flurry of technical details, deployment schedules, rules of engagement, communication protocols, but Elena barely heard any of it. Her mind was stuck on a single terrifying realization. In less than 72 hours, she might be expected to take a shot that could mean the difference between life and death for American service members, a shot she couldn't even make on a static range dot. As the cadets filed out of the briefing room, Elena felt the weight of dozens of stares. Word of her struggles had spread throughout the company, and now everyone was wondering the same thing. What would happen if the girl who couldn't hit a target was suddenly expected to provide overwatch for a combat operation? "Elena, wait up." Corporal Walsh pushed through the crowd, her expression serious. "We need to talk." They found a quiet corner in the supply warehouse, away from the chaos of cadets scrambling to prepare for their new assignments. Walsh crossed her arms and studied Elena with the kind of direct assessment that only came from someone who had seen combat. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Walsh said. "Are you going to be able to do this? Because if there's any doubt at all, you need to speak up now. Lives are going to depend on the people providing overwatch, and there's no shame in admitting you're not ready for that responsibility." Elena opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The honest answer was that she had no idea if she could do it. The thought of being responsible for other people's safety while struggling with her own fundamental skills was terrifying. But the alternative, admitting defeat and stepping aside while her peers rose to meet the challenge, felt even worse. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I'm going to try." Walsh nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But trying isn't going to be enough. If you freeze up when it matters, you need to find whatever's blocking you, and you need to find it fast." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity that pushed Elena's struggles temporarily into the background. Charlie Company was tasked with establishing observation posts around the perimeter of Fort Brennan, positions that would monitor approaches to the base while larger forces prepared for overseas deployment. It was serious work, the kind that required constant vigilance and absolute competence. Elena was assigned to Observation Post Delta, positioned on a hilltop overlooking the main access road to the base. Her partner was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran sniper with 2 combat tours and a reputation for never missing anything that mattered. If Elena was going to have a breakdown, at least she'd have competent backup. "First rule of Overwatch," Rodriguez explained as they established their position. "Your primary job isn't to shoot, it's to observe and report. The shooting only happens when observation and reporting have failed to solve the problem." Elena nodded, grateful for the reminder that her rifle was just one tool among many. She settled behind her M40A5, adjusting the scope to cover the southern approach to the base. Through the 10x magnification, she could see every detail of the landscape, the way shadows fell across the access road, the patterns of civilian traffic, the subtle differences between normal activity and potential threats. For the first few hours, the work was almost meditative. Elena found herself relaxing into the rhythm of professional observation, cataloging vehicles, personnel, and patterns of movement. The familiar weight of the rifle became comforting rather than intimidating when she wasn't being asked to prove her competence with every trigger pull. "You're good at this," Rodriguez observed during a quiet moment. "You've got the patience for it and the attention to detail. Most people get bored after an hour and start missing things." "It's different when it's real," Elena replied, surprised by her own insight. "When it's just training, I get so focused on performing that I forget about the mission." "This feels like it actually matters," Rodriguez smiled. "That's the difference between a shooter and a sniper. Shooters worry about hitting targets. Snipers worry about completing missions." The comment struck Elena with unexpected force. She'd been thinking of herself as a failed shooter for so long that she'd never considered the possibility that she might be a natural sniper. The distinction seemed small, but it felt profound, the difference between focusing on technique and focusing on purpose. That sense of growing confidence lasted exactly 14 hours, until Captain Reed appeared at their position with orders. That would test Elena's newfound understanding of her role. "We've got a situation developing," Reed said, her tone all business. "Intelligence indicates possible hostile reconnaissance of the base perimeter. Command wants sniper teams forward deployed to observation points with clear sight lines to potential infiltration routes." Elena felt her mouth go dry. Forward deployment meant leaving the relative safety of the established observation post for positions closer to potential threats. It meant increased responsibility, higher stakes, and quite possibly the need to take shots under combat conditions. "Rodriguez, you'll take the primary position overlooking the eastern approach," Reed continued. "Vasquez, you'll be covering the northern sector from Hill 347. It's a 1,000-meter shot to the most likely infiltration point, well within your capabilities." Elena wanted to point out that 1,000 meters was actually well beyond her demonstrated capabilities, but the words stuck in her throat. This wasn't the time for self-doubt or requests for easier assignments. This was the moment when she either stepped up or stepped aside. "Understood, ma'am," she managed. Rodriguez gave her a reassuring nod as they prepared to move to their new positions. "Remember what I told you about mission focus," he said quietly. "Don't think about the shot. Think about what you're protecting." The move to Hill 347 took 2 hours of careful movement through terrain that offered concealment from potential observers. Elena traveled light rifle, ammunition, water, and the kind of focused determination that came from understanding there were no second chances. As she established her new position, she could see the northern approach to Fort Brennan, spread out below her like a tactical map. The suspected infiltration route was clearly visible, a kosa, dry creek bed that offered covered movement to within 500 meters of the base perimeter. Any hostiles using that route would have to cross an open area of roughly 200 meters to reach the fence line. It was there, at the edge of that open area, that Elena would need to engage them if diplomacy and warning shots failed to deter their advance. She settled into position just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Through her scope, she methodically examined every potential hide, every possible approach, every piece of terrain that might conceal a threat. The work was demanding but familiar, essentially an extension of the observation skills she'd been developing over the past few days. Hours passed in silence. Elena's radio crackled occasionally with position reports from other teams, but her sector remained quiet. She began to allow herself to hope that this would be a quiet night, that the intelligence had been wrong, or that potential threats had decided against testing the base's defenses. That hope died at 0347, hours when her night vision scope picked up movement in the creek bed. 3 figures moving with the kind of disciplined stealth that spoke of military training. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them advance through the shadows, weapons visible in the green glow of her scope. These weren't curious civilians or lost hikers. These were professionals with hostile intent. "Base, this is Overwatch 7, Elena whispered into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I have 3 armed individuals moving through the northern infiltration route. Distance approximately 800 meters and closing." "Copy, Overwatch 7, came the immediate response. "You are cleared to observe and report. Do not engage unless they present an immediate threat to base security." Elena tracked the figures as they moved closer, noting their equipment and tactics. 2 carried assault rifles, while the third appeared to have some kind of heavy weapon, possibly a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. They moved in a perfect tactical formation, covering each other's advance with practiced efficiency. As they reached the edge of the open area, the lead figure raised his hand, calling a halt. Elena could see him studying the base perimeter through what appeared to be night vision goggles, calculating distances and angles. The second figure began unpacking the equipment from a large rucksack. "Base, this is Overwatch 7, Elena reported. "Hostiles have stopped at the tree line. One appears to be setting up heavy weapons. Distance now 600 meters. Copy. Continue to observe." Through her scope, Elena watched the third figure assemble what was definitely an RPG launcher. The weapon's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable, a Soviet-era RPG-7, still the weapon of choice for insurgent forces around the world. With a range of 500 meters, it could easily reach the barracks where hundreds of Marines were sleeping. "Base, hostile forces setting up RPG position," Elena reported, her voice tight with urgency. "They have a clear shot at multiple structures. Overwatch 7, you are authorized to engage if you have a clean shot." The words Elena had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Authorization to engage. Permission to take the shot that would either save lives or reveal her complete inadequacy when it mattered most. She adjusted her position slightly, settling deeper into the natural depression in the hilltop that provided both concealment and a stable shooting platform. The range was approximately 580 meters, challenging, but not impossible. The wind was minimal, maybe 3 knots from the southwest. Temperature was dropping, which would affect bullet trajectory. All factors she'd calculated 1,000 times. In training. But this time, there was no do-over if she missed. No instructor offering advice on scope adjustment. No second chance to prove herself. Elena centered her crosshairs on the figure with the RPG launcher. Through the scope, she could see him loading a rocket, preparing to take aim at the base. In her peripheral vision, she was aware of the other 2 figures providing security, their rifles scanning the darkness for threats. She controlled her breathing, letting her body settle into the familiar rhythm of marksmanship. Inhale, exhale. Halfway, hold. The crosshairs steadied on her target's center mass, wavering only slightly with her natural body movement. This was it. The moment Captain Reed had warned her about. The shot that would define everything that came after. But as Elena began to apply pressure to the trigger, something unexpected happened. Instead of the familiar panic that had plagued her for months, she felt a strange calm descending over her consciousness. The world seemed to slow down, details becoming crystal clear in a way they never had during training. She could see the terrorist's finger on the RPG trigger, could see the rocket in the launcher, ready to arc across the darkness toward the sleeping Marines, could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, like a familiar cloak. This wasn't about proving herself anymore. This wasn't about family expectations or personal glory. This was about her Marines who were counting on her to do her job. Just like Rodriguez had said, snipers complete missions. Elena found her natural point of aim and squeezed the trigger with steady, deliberate pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she held the trigger back for a full second before releasing, maintaining her sight picture to spot the impact. Through the scope, she watched the 7.62 millimeters bullet strike her target center mass. The terrorist collapsed immediately, the RPG launcher falling from his grip and clattering against the rocky ground. Hit, Elena reported, her voice remarkably steady. Primary target down. The effect was immediate. The remaining 2 terrorists scrambled for cover, their carefully planned attack dissolving into confusion and panic. Without the heavy weapons support they'd counted on, their mission became impossible to complete. "Nice shot, 7, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "I've got eyes on the remaining hostiles. They're falling back to the creek bed." Elena continued to observe through her scope, tracking the retreating figures as they dragged their wounded comrade away from the planned attack site. Within 10 minutes, they had disappeared back into the maze of ravines and dry washes that crisscrossed the landscape. "Base, this is Overwatch 7, Elena reported. "Hostile forces have withdrawn. Area appears clear." "Outstanding work, Overwatch 7. Maintain your position until further notice." As the immediate adrenaline began to fade, Elena found herself staring through her scope at the spot where the terrorist had fallen. She had just taken her first life-ended someone's existence with a single precisely placed bullet. The weight of that action should have been crushing, should have left her shaking with horror or guilt. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, complete confidence in her abilities and her purpose. The shot had been clean, necessary, and effective. She had protected her fellow Marines from a threat that could have killed dozens of sleeping soldiers. Most importantly, she had done it without hesitation, without the paralyzing self-doubt that had been her constant companion for so long. 7. "This is Rodriguez," came the quiet voice through her radio. "How you doing over there?" "I'm good, Sergeant," Elena replied and realized she meant it. "Really good, copy that. Welcome to the Brotherhood, Marine." The words sent a chill down Elena's spine, not of fear, but of recognition. She had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed, had proven herself worthy of the title she'd been working so hard to earn. But more than that, She had found the missing piece of herself that had been hiding beneath layers of expectation and fear. She was a Marine sniper. Not because it was expected of her, not because it would make her family proud, but because it was what she was meant to be. The rifle in her hands wasn't a burden or a test, it was simply the tool. She used to serve her country and protect her brothers and sisters in arms. Dawn was breaking over the Georgia landscape when Elena finally received orders to return to base. The long hike back to Fort Brennan gave her time to process what had happened, to understand how fundamentally everything had changed in the space of a single trigger pulled. As she approached the main gate, she found Captain Reed waiting for her, along with Colonel Martinez and several other senior officers. Word of the night's events had clearly spread quickly through the command structure. "Well done, Vasquez," Colonel Martinez said, his tone carrying the kind of respect that couldn't be manufactured or faked. "That was exactly the kind of precision engagement we need from our snipers. You may have prevented a significant loss of life." Elena nodded her thanks, but her attention was focused on Captain Reed, who was studying her with those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "How do you feel?" Reed asked simply. "Different," Elena replied honestly. "Like I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." Reed smiled, the first genuine smile Elena had ever seen from her. "The hardest part isn't learning to shoot, Vasquez. The hardest part is learning to trust yourself to make the shot when it matters. You've crossed that line. Everything else is just practice." The formal debriefing took most of the morning, with Elena recounting every detail of the engagement. For the official record: range, weather conditions, target identification, rules of engagement compliance, all the technical details that would become part of her permanent file. But the real significance of the event became clear when she returned to the barracks. Her fellow cadets treated her differently, now not with the mixture of sympathy and embarrassment that had characterized their interactions for weeks, but with genuine respect. She had done what they all hoped they would be capable of doing. When the moment came, Marcus was the first to approach her, his expression mixing relief and admiration. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "Are you okay?" "More than okay," Elena replied. "I feel like I've been trying to be someone else this whole time, and I finally figured out who I actually am." "And who's that?" Elena shouldered her rifle, feeling its familiar weight settle against her body like an extension of herself. "A Marine sniper who happens to be very good at her job." Over the following days, Elena's transformation became even more apparent. The same techniques that had frustrated her for months suddenly clicked into place with mechanical precision. The breathing exercises she'd struggled with became second nature. The trigger control that had been erratic became smooth and consistent. Most importantly, the mental approach that had been her greatest weakness became her greatest strength. Instead of seeing each shot as a test of her worthiness, she approached every training evolution with the calm professionalism of someone who understood exactly what was being asked of her and why it mattered. Her scores improved dramatically. At 200 meters, she was consistently hitting the center ring. At 500 meters, her groups were tight enough to cover with a silver dollar. At 800 meters, the distance that had seemed impossible just a week earlier, she was performing at the level of the top cadets in the class. But Elena knew that her real test was still coming. Captain Reed had mentioned that the final qualification would be at real distance, the kind of shot that separated pretenders from genuine snipers. Elena had a feeling she knew exactly what that meant, and the brass plaque in the museum seemed to call to her every time she passed it. 2,847 meters. The longest confirmed sniper kill in Marine Corps history. A shot that would require not just technical skill, but absolute mastery of every variable that could affect a bullet's flight over such an incredible distance. Wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes. Temperature variations between firing position and target area. Barometric pressure. Even the rotation of the Earth itself would become a factor at such extreme range. Elena had been studying the physics of ultra-long-range shooting with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She'd calculated ballistic coefficients, studied atmospheric models, and memorized tables of data that most snipers would never need. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that her moment of ultimate testing was approaching. That moment came sooner than she expected. 3 weeks after the incident, at Hill 347, Elena found herself standing in Captain Reed's office, staring at a set of orders that would change the trajectory of her entire career. The document was brief but momentous. Temporary assignment to a classified operation requiring her unique skills. "I can't give you many details," Reed explained, her voice carrying the weight of operational security. "What I can tell you is that we have a high-value target that needs to be eliminated, and conventional approaches aren't viable. The shot will be at extreme range, under less than ideal conditions, with no possibility of a second chance." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "How extreme, ma'am?" Reed hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. The preliminary calculations put it at approximately 2,800 meters, possibly further, depending on final positioning. The number hit Elena like a physical force. 2,800 meters. Close enough to the record-setting distance that had been haunting her thoughts to feel like destiny calling. This wasn't just another training evolution or qualification shoot. This was the kind of mission that legends were made of. "Why me?" Elena asked, not from false modesty, but from genuine curiosity. There were other snipers in the program with more experience, higher scores, longer service records. "Because you're the only cadet who's proven she can make the shot that matters when everything is on the line," Reed replied. "Technical skill can be taught, Vasquez. Mental fortitude under extreme pressure is something you either have or you don't. 3 weeks ago, you demonstrated that you have it." The briefing took place in a secure conference room deep within Fort Brennan's intelligence complex. Elena found herself sitting across from officers whose ranks and affiliations were deliberately obscured, studying satellite photos and terrain maps of a location that could have been anywhere in the world. "The target is a bomb maker," explained a colonel whose name wasn't provided, "responsible for devices that have killed over 200 American service members and civilians. He operates from a compound that's heavily fortified and positioned in terrain that makes conventional assault extremely costly." Elena studied the photos, noting the defensive positions, the elevation differences, and the clear fields of fire that would make any ground approach a nightmare for attacking forces. The compound sat on a rocky hilltop surrounded by open ground, protected by multiple layers of security and early warning systems. "Our intelligence indicates he'll be vulnerable for approximately 30 minutes. During a scheduled meeting with other terrorist leaders," the colonel continued. "The window is narrow, the conditions are challenging, and failure means he disappears. For months or years." Another officer, this one wearing the uniform of Army Special Operations, leaned forward. "The shooting position we've identified is 2,847 meters from the target area. It's the only location that offers concealment, a clear sight line, and a viable extraction route." Elena felt her breath catch. 2,847 meters. The exact distance from the brass plaque in the museum, not close to the record, but the record itself. Whether this was coincidence or destiny, she couldn't tell, but the symmetry was unmistakable. "Environmental conditions are less than ideal," the briefing continued. "High altitude, variable winds, temperature differentials of up to 20 degrees between firing position and target area. The shot will need to be taken in the pre-dawn hours to maximize concealment, which means dealing with temperature inversions and shifting air currents." Elena absorbed every detail, her mind already beginning the complex calculations required for such an extreme engagement. Bullet drop at 2,847 meters would be measured in hundreds of inches. Wind drift could move the projectile several feet off. Target. The flight time would be over 4 seconds, during which any movement by the target could result in a clean miss. This isn't a training exercise, the Special Operations Officer emphasized. This is a real-world mission with strategic implications. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Elena thought about the question seriously before answering. 3 weeks ago, she would have been paralyzed by the magnitude of what was being asked. Now, after proving herself under fire, she felt only the calm focus that had become her trademark. "Yes, sir," she replied without hesitation. The mission preparation took 5 days of intensive training and rehearsal. Elena worked with a team of specialist meteorologists who could predict wind patterns at different altitudes, ballistics experts who helped refine her calculations, and special operations planners who choreographed every aspect of the infiltration and extraction. She fired hundreds of practice rounds at various distances, fine-tuning her technique and building the muscle memory required for consistent performance. But the real work was mental visualizing the shot over and over, rehearsing every step of the engagement process until it became as automatic as breathing. The rifle selected for the mission was a highly modified M40A5, equipped with a specialized long-range scope and loaded with match-grade ammunition, hand-selected for consistency. Every component had been tested and calibrated to deliver maximum accuracy at extreme range. Elena spent hours studying the ballistics tables for her specific ammunition, memorizing the data that would guide her calculations in the field. At 2,847 meters, her bullet would drop nearly 60 feet from the line of sight, requiring her to aim at a point far above the target's visible position. Wind corrections could be equally dramatic, potentially requiring her to aim several feet to one side to compensate for drift. But the most challenging aspect wasn't the technical calculations, it was the psychological pressure of making a shot that would either save countless lives or allow a dangerous terrorist to continue his work. Unlike training, where missing simply meant another attempt, this engagement would have exactly one opportunity for success. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The insertion took place on a moonless night, with Elena and a small special operations team infiltrating by helicopter to a landing zone 15 kilometers from the shooting position. They moved through rough terrain for hours, navigating by GPS and night vision, until they reached the carefully selected firing position. Just as dawn was beginning to break, Elena's shooting position was a natural depression in the rocky ground that provided concealment while offering a clear sight line to the target compound. She established herself behind the rifle, adjusting the bipod legs and settling into the prone position that had become as familiar as sitting in a chair. Her scope, the target compound, looked impossibly distant. A cluster of buildings wavering in the morning heat shimmered like a mirage. At maximum magnification, she could barely make out individual structures, let alone the specific location where her target would appear. "Wind is variable, 5 to 10 knots from the southwest," reported the team's weather specialist, monitoring conditions with sophisticated instruments. "Temperature differential between your position and the target is approximately 18 degrees. Elena made the necessary adjustments to her scope, calculating the ballistic solution based on the current conditions. At this range, every variable mattered. A change in wind speed of just 2 knots could move her bullet several feet off target. A temperature variation of 5 degrees could alter the bullet's trajectory by multiple inches. Hours passed in patient observation. Elena tracked the compound through her scope, noting patterns of movement and activity. Guards walked their routes with mechanical precision. Vehicles came and went from a heavily fortified entrance. Normal daily activity continued while she waited for the brief window when her target would be vulnerable. "Movement in the courtyard," she reported quietly into her radio. Multiple individuals, but not the primary target. The waiting was the hardest part. Elena's body was perfectly still, her breathing controlled and rhythmic, but her mind raced through the calculations and contingencies that would determine success or failure. She had trained for this moment for months, had proven herself capable under combat conditions, but this shot represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned. At 0347 hours, the same time as her first successful engagement, Elena's target appeared. He was exactly where intelligence had predicted, standing in an open courtyard while consulting with two other men. Through her scope, Elena could see him clearly for the first time, a middle-aged man in traditional robes, gesturing as he spoke, unaware that he was being observed from nearly 3 kilometers away. "Target acquired," Elena reported, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Clear shot, conditions stable." "You are cleared to engage," came the immediate response. Elena centered her crosshairs on a point, approximately 20 feet above and 6 feet to the right of her target, the calculated aim point that would compensate for bullet drop and wind drift over the 2,847-meter distance. The image wavered slightly in the heat shimmer, requiring her to focus intensely to maintain precise alignment. She controlled her breathing, letting her body settle into complete stillness. This was the moment that everything had been building toward: all the training, all the failures, all the gradual understanding of what it meant to be a Marine sniper. Not just the technical skills, but the mental discipline to make an impossible shot when lives depended on it. Elena found her natural point of aim and began applying pressure to the trigger. The weight was exactly as she remembered from thousands of practice rounds, crisp, clean, breaking at precisely the right moment. She held her breath, steadied her body, and made the microscopic adjustments that would send a bullet across nearly 3 kilometers of air to find its target. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar authority. Elena held the trigger back, maintaining her sight picture while the bullet began its 4-second journey through the morning air. At this distance, she couldn't see the impact, couldn't immediately confirm success or failure. For 4 seconds, an eternity in sniper time, Elena watched through her scope while physics and mathematics determined the outcome of months of training and preparation. The bullet arced high above the intervening terrain, following a parabolic path that would either confirm her place among the Marine Corps' elite snipers or prove that some shots were simply beyond human capability. Then, at 2,847 meters, her target collapsed. "Hit," Elena reported, her voice carrying across the radio to confirm what would become the longest confirmed sniper kill in Marine Corps history. "Target eliminated." The compound erupted into chaos as guards scrambled to understand what had happened, but they were searching for threats at normal engagement ranges, not looking for a sniper positioned almost 3 kilometers away. Elena's position remained secure, undetected, and mission complete. "Outstanding," came the response from command. "Extract immediately." As Elena secured her rifle and prepared to move from her position, she felt the profound satisfaction of a mission completed with perfect precision. She had achieved something that most snipers could only dream of, a shot that would be studied and remembered for decades to come. But more importantly, she had fulfilled the purpose that had driven her through months of failure and self-doubt. She had served her country and protected innocent lives by removing a threat that conventional forces couldn't reach. The technical achievement was significant, but the mission success was what truly mattered. The extraction went smoothly, with Elena and her team moving to the pickup point without detection. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her away from what would become a legendary engagement, Elena stared out at the landscape below and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 months earlier, she had been on the verge of washing out of sniper training, unable to hit stationary targets at basic ranges. Now she held the record for the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history. The transformation seemed impossible, but Elena understood exactly how it had happened. She had stopped trying to be what other people expected, and started being who she actually was. She had learned to see past the rifle to the mission, past the technique to the purpose, past her own limitations to the responsibilities that defined her service. Most importantly, she had discovered that being a Marine sniper wasn't about proving herself. It was about serving something larger than herself with absolute dedication and professional competence. Forward, operating base Atlas sat like a concrete and steel oasis. In the Moroccan desert, 30 kilometers from the Algerian border, where intelligence indicated the terrorist cells responsible for the embassy attacks had established their command structure. Elena had been on the ground for 6 days now, and the reality of deployment had proven both more mundane and more intense than anything her training had prepared her for. The days blended together in a routine of patrol preparations, equipment, maintenance, intelligence briefings, and the constant low-level tension that came from operating in a threat environment. Elena had been assigned to 3rd Platoon's designated marksman role, providing overwatch for patrol operations and perimeter security for the forward operating base. So far, she hadn't fired a single shot in anger. Her rifle had remained clean and ready, but unused for anything more threatening than deterring curious locals who wandered too close to the perimeter. Part of her was grateful for the reprieve. It gave her time to settle into the deployment rhythm and continue working on the mental adjustments that had begun during her final days at Fort Brennan. But a larger part of her knew that the peaceful interlude was temporary. Intelligence reports suggested that terrorist forces were probing the area, testing response times and defensive capabilities in preparation for a larger operation. It was only a matter of time before Elena would be asked to prove herself under the most demanding conditions possible. That test came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, announced by the harsh wail of incoming rocket alarms and the distinctive crack of rifle fire from the eastern perimeter. Elena rolled out of her cot with practiced efficiency, grabbing her rifle and gear in a motion that had become automatic after weeks of repetition. All hands, the base loudspeaker crackled. We are taking indirect fire from multiple positions. This is not a drill. All personnel to designated defensive positions. Elena's position was Overwatch Tower 7, a concrete and steel structure that provided commanding views of the approaches to FOB Atlas. She reached the tower in less than 4 minutes, her breathing controlled despite the sprint across the compound while explosions bloomed in the darkness around her. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the tower's senior observer, was already in position with a pair of high-powered binoculars when Elena arrived. Vasquez, good. We've got multiple firing positions. In the ridgeline to the east. Range approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters. Your job is to identify and engage any threats in your sector. Elena settled behind her rifle, adjusting the bipod legs and settling into the familiar firing position that had become second nature over months of training. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes winking in the pre-dawn darkness, at least 6 different positions, coordinated and disciplined in their fire patterns. I see them, Elena reported. 6 positions staggered along the ridge. They're using the high ground for plunging fire into the compound. Can you get a clear shot on any of them? Elena swept her scope across the ridgeline, looking for targets. The range was challenging, nearly 2,000 meters to the furthest positions, but not impossible. The real problem was identifying specific threats in the chaos of muzzle flashes and shifting shadows. Then she saw him dot at 1,847 meters, partially concealed behind a rocky outcropping. A figure in dark clothing was setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. Unlike the rifle fire coming from other positions, this weapon would be capable of devastating the lightly armored vehicles and personnel shelters scattered around FOB Atlas. Heavy weapons position, bearing 075, range 1800 meters, Elena reported. He's setting up what looks like a PKM machine gun. Can you take the shot? Elena centered her crosshairs on the distant figure, her mind automatically calculating the ballistic solution. 1800 meters, moderate crosswind from the southwest. Temperature differential between her position and the target area. Altitude differences. All factors that would affect bullet trajectory over the long flight time to target. But instead of the familiar panic that had plagued her for months, Elena felt something different settling over her. A calm focus that seemed to slow time and sharpen every detail in her field of view. She could see the target's movements with crystal clarity, could feel the rhythm of her own breathing, could sense the exact moment when all the variables aligned. For the perfect shot, she thought of her grandfather, of the entry in his logbook about learning to see past the rifle to the mission. This wasn't about proving her marksmanship skills or living up to family expectations. This was about the Marines, in the compound below, who would be torn apart if that heavy machine gun opened fire on their positions. Under combat conditions, but this shot represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned. At 0347 hours, the same time as her first successful engagement, Elena's target appeared. He was exactly where intelligence had predicted, standing in an open courtyard while consulting with two other men. Through her scope, Elena could see him clearly for the first time, a middle-aged man in traditional robes, gesturing as he spoke, unaware that he was being observed from nearly 3 kilometers away. Target acquired, Elena reported, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Clear shot, conditions stable. You are cleared to engage, came the immediate response. Elena centered her crosshairs on a point, approximately 20 feet above and 6 feet to the right of her target, the calculated aim point that would compensate for bullet drop and wind drift over the 2,847-meter distance. The image wavered slightly in the heat shimmer, requiring her to focus intensely to maintain precise alignment. She controlled her breathing, letting her body settle into complete stillness. This was the moment that everything had been building toward, all the training, all the failures, all the gradual understanding of what it meant to be a Marine sniper. Not just the technical skills, but the mental discipline to make an impossible shot when lives depended on it. Elena found her natural point of aim and began applying pressure to the trigger. The weight was exactly as she remembered from thousands of practice rounds, crisp, clean, breaking at precisely the right moment. She held her breath, steadied her body, and made the microscopic adjustments that would send a bullet across nearly 3 kilometers of air to find its target. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar authority. Elena held the trigger back, maintaining her sight picture while the bullet began its 4-second journey through the morning air. At this distance, she couldn't see the impact, couldn't immediately confirm success or failure. For 4 seconds, an eternity in sniper time, Elena watched through her scope while physics and mathematics determined the outcome of months of training and preparation. The bullet arced high above the intervening terrain, following a parabolic path that would either confirm her place among the Marine Corps' elite snipers or prove that some shots were simply beyond human capability. Then, at 2,847 meters, her target collapsed. Hit, Elena reported, her voice carrying across the radio to confirm what would become the longest confirmed sniper kill in Marine Corps history. Target eliminated. The compound erupted into chaos as guards scrambled to understand what had happened, but they were searching for threats at normal engagement ranges, not looking for a sniper positioned almost 3 kilometers away. Elena's position remained secure, undetected, and mission complete. Outstanding, came the response from command. Extract immediately. As Elena secured her rifle and prepared to move from her position, she felt the profound satisfaction of a mission completed with perfect precision. She had achieved something that most snipers could only dream of, a shot that would be studied and remembered for decades to come. But more importantly, she had fulfilled the purpose that had driven her. Through months of failure and self-doubt, she had served her country and protected innocent lives by removing a threat that conventional forces couldn't reach. The technical achievement was significant, but the mission success was what truly mattered. The extraction went smoothly, with Elena and her team moving to the pickup point without detection. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her away from what would become a legendary engagement, Elena stared out at the landscape below and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 months earlier, she had been on the verge of washing out of sniper training, unable to hit stationary targets at basic ranges. Now she held the record for the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history. The transformation seemed impossible, but Elena understood exactly how it had happened. She had stopped trying to be what other people expected, and started being who she actually was. She had learned to see past the rifle to the mission, past the technique to the purpose, past her own limitations to the responsibilities that defined her service. Most importantly, she had discovered that being a Marine sniper wasn't about proving herself. It was about serving something larger than herself with absolute dedication and professional competence. Forward, operating base Atlas sat like a concrete and steel oasis. In the Moroccan desert, 30 kilometers from the Algerian border, where intelligence indicated the terrorist cells responsible for the embassy attacks had established their command structure. Elena had been on the ground for 6 days now, and the reality of deployment had proven both more mundane and more intense than anything her training had prepared her for. The days blended together in a routine of patrol preparations, equipment, maintenance, intelligence briefings, and the constant low-level tension that came from operating in a threat environment. Elena had been assigned to 3rd Platoon's designated marksman role, providing overwatch for patrol operations and perimeter security for the forward operating base. So far, she hadn't fired a single shot in anger. Her rifle had remained clean and ready, but unused for anything more threatening than deterring curious locals who wandered too close to the perimeter. Part of her was grateful for the reprieve. It gave her time to settle into the deployment rhythm and continue working on the mental adjustments that had begun during her final days at Fort Brennan. But a larger part of her knew that the peaceful interlude was temporary. Intelligence reports suggested that terrorist forces were probing the area, testing response times and defensive capabilities in preparation for a larger operation. It was only a matter of time before Elena would be asked to prove herself under the most demanding conditions possible. That test came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, announced by the harsh wail of incoming rocket alarms and the distinctive crack of rifle fire from the eastern perimeter. Elena rolled out of her cot with practiced efficiency, grabbing her rifle and gear in a motion that had become automatic after weeks of repetition. All hands, the base loudspeaker crackled. We are taking indirect fire from multiple positions. This is not a drill. All personnel to designated defensive positions. Elena's position was Overwatch Tower 7, a concrete and steel structure that provided commanding views of the approaches to FOB Atlas. She reached the tower in less than 4 minutes, her breathing controlled despite the sprint across the compound while explosions bloomed in the darkness around her. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the tower's senior observer, was already in position with a pair of high-powered binoculars when Elena arrived. Vasquez, good. We've got multiple firing positions in the ridgeline to the east. Range approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters. Your job is to identify and engage any threats in your sector. Elena settled behind her rifle, adjusting the bipod legs and settling into the familiar firing position that had become second nature over months of training. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes winking in the pre-dawn darkness, at least 6 different positions, coordinated and disciplined in their fire patterns. I see them, Elena reported. 6 positions staggered along the ridge. They're using the high ground for plunging fire into the compound. Can you get a clear shot on any of them? Elena swept her scope across the ridgeline, looking for targets. The range was challenging, nearly 2,000 meters to the furthest positions, but not impossible. The real problem was identifying specific threats in the chaos of muzzle flashes and shifting shadows. Then she saw him dot at 1,847 meters, partially concealed behind a rocky outcropping. A figure in dark clothing was setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. Unlike the rifle fire coming from other positions, this weapon would be capable of devastating the lightly armored vehicles and personnel shelters scattered around Fob Atlas. Heavy weapons position, bearing 075, range 1,800 meters, Elena reported. He's setting up what looks like a PKM machine gun. Can you take the shot? Elena centered her crosshairs on the distant figure, her mind automatically calculating the ballistic solution. 1,800 meters, moderate crosswind from the southwest. Temperature differential between her position and the target area. Altitude differences. All factors that would affect bullet trajectory over the long flight time to target. But instead of the familiar panic that had plagued her for months, Elena felt something different settling over her. A calm focus that seemed to slow time and sharpen every detail in her field of view. She could see the target's movements with crystal clarity, could feel the rhythm of her own breathing, could sense the exact moment when all the variables aligned. For the perfect shot, she thought of her grandfather, of the entry in his logbook about learning to see past the rifle to the mission. This wasn't about proving her marksmanship skills or living up to family expectations. This was about the Marines in the compound below who would be torn apart if that heavy machine gun opened fire on their positions.